Hey, I'm back to finish our at least first chapter. We might read into the second chapter of Half Magic. So remember, we left off with Jane and her brother and sisters being so bored that Jane was so disgusted that she said right out loud she wished there'd be a fire. The other three looked shocked at hearing such wickedness, and then looked more shocked at what they heard next. I feel like this is super high. At what they heard next. What they heard next was a fire siren. Fire trucks started tearing past, the engine puffing out smoke the way it used to do in those days. The chief's car, the hook and ladder, the chemicals. Mark and Catherine and Martha looked at Jane, and Jane looked back at them with wild wonder in her eyes. Then they started running. The fire was 8 blocks away, and it took them a long time to get there because Martha wasn't allowed to cross streets by herself and couldn't run fast yet like the others. So they had to keep waiting for her to catch up at all the corners. And when they finally reached the house where the trucks had stopped, it wasn't the house that was on fire. It was a playhouse in the backyard, the fanciest playhouse the children had ever seen, 2 stories high and with dormer windows. You all know what watching a fire is like. The glory of the flames streaming out through the windows and the wonderful moment when the roof falls in. Or even better, if there's a tower and it falls through the roof. This playhouse did have a tower, and it fell through the roof most beautifully with a crash and a shower of sparks. And the fact that it was a playhouse and small like the children made it seem even more like a special fire that was planned just for them. And the little girl the playhouse belonged to turned out to be an unmistakably spoiled and unpleasant type named Genevieve, with long golden curls that had probably never been cut. So that was all right. And furthermore, the children overheard her father say he'd buy her a new playhouse with the insurance money. So altogether, there was no reason for any but feelings of the deepest satisfaction in the breast of the 4 children as they stood breathing heavily and watching the firemen deal with the flames, which they did with that heroic calm typical of fire departments the world over. And it wasn't until the last flame was drowned and the playhouse stood there a wet and smoking mess of ashes and charred boards that guilt rose up in Jane and turned to her joy to ashes too. "Oh, what you did," Martha whispered at her. "I don't want to talk about it," Jane said. But she went over to a woman who seemed to be the nurse of the golden-haired Genevieve and asked her how it started. "All of a piece it went up like the 4th of July as ever was," said the nurse. "And it's my opinion," she added, looking at Jane very suspiciously, "that it was set. What are you doing here, little girl?" Jane turned right around and walked out of the yard, holding herself as straight as possible and trying to keep from running. The other 3 went after her. "Is Jane magic?" Martha whispered to Catherine. "I don't know. I think so," Catherine whispered back. Jane glared at them. They went for 2 blocks in silence. "Are we magic too?" "I don't know. I'm scared to find out." Jane glared. Once more silence fell. But this time Martha couldn't hold herself in for more than half a block. "Will we be burnt as witches?" Jane whirled on them furiously. "I wish," she started to say. "Don't!" almost screamed Catherine, and Jane turned white, shut her lips tight, and started walking faster. Mark made the others run to catch up. "This won't do any good. We've got to talk it over," he told Jane. "Yes, talk it over," said Martha, looking less worried. She had great respect for Mark, who was a boy and knew everything. "The thing is," Mark went on, "was it just an accident? Or did we want so much to be magic we got that way somehow? The thing is, each of us ought to make a wish. That'll prove it one way or the other." But Martha balked at this. You could never tell with Martha. Sometimes she would act just as grown up as the others, and then suddenly she would be a baby. Now she was a baby. Her lip trembled, and she said she didn't want to make a wish, and she wouldn't make a wish, and she wished they'd never started to play this game in the first place. After consultation, Mark and Catherine decided this could count as Martha's wish, and it didn't seem to have come true, because if it had, they wouldn't remember any of the morning, and yet they remembered it all too clearly. But just as a test, Mark turned to Jane. What have we been doing? He asked. Watching a fire, said Jane bitterly, and at that moment the fire trucks went by on their way home to the station to prove it. So then Mark rather depressedly wished his shoes were 7-league boots, but when he tried to jump 7 leagues, it turned out they weren't. Catherine wished Shakespeare would come up and talk to her. She forgot to say exactly when she wanted this to happen, but after they had waited a minute and he didn't appear, they decided he probably wasn't coming. So it seemed that if there was any magic among them, Jane had it all. But try as they might, they couldn't persuade Jane to make another wish, even a little safe one. She just kept shaking her head at all their arguments, and when argument descended to insult, she didn't say a word, which was most unlike Jane. When they got home, she said she had a headache and went out on the sleeping porch and shut the door. She wouldn't even come downstairs for lunch, but stayed out there all alone all afternoon, moodily eating a whole box of social tea biscuits and talking to Carrie the cat. Miss Bick despaired of her. When their mother came home, she knew something was wrong, but being an understanding parent, she didn't ask questions. At dinner, she announced that she was going out for the evening. Jane didn't look up from her brooding silence, but the others were interested. The children always hoped their mother was going on exciting adventures, though she seldom was. Tonight she was going to see Aunt Grace and Uncle Edwin. Why? Mark wanted to know. They were very kind to me after your father died. They have been very kind to you. Ha! Useful presents, Mark was scornful. Will Aunt Grace say, just a little chocolate cake, best you ever tasted, I made it myself? Catherine wanted to know. You shouldn't laugh at your Aunt Grace. I don't know what your father would say. Father laughed at her too. It isn't the same thing. Why? This kind of conversation was always very interesting to the children and could have gone on forever so far as they were concerned, but somehow no grown-ups ever seemed to feel that way about conversations. Their mother put a stop to this one by leaving for Aunt Grace's. When she had gone, things got strange again. Jane kept hovering in and out of the room where the others were playing a half-hearted game of flinch until everyone was driven wild. Finally, Mark burst out. Why don't you tell us? Jane shook her head. I can't. You wouldn't understand. Naturally, this made everyone furious. Just because she's magic, she thinks she's smarter, Martha said. I don't think she's magic at all, this was Catherine. Only she's afraid to make a wish and find out. I'm not. I am, Jane cried, not very clearly. Only I don't know why or how much. It's like having one foot almost asleep, but not quite. You can't use it and you can't enjoy it. I'm afraid to even think a wish. I'm afraid to think at all. If you have ever had magic powers descend on you suddenly out of the blue, you'll know how Jane felt. When you have magic powers and know it, it can be a fine feeling, like a pleasant tingling inside. But in order to enjoy that tingling, you have to know just how much magic you have and what the rules are for using it. And Jane didn't have any idea how much she had or how to use it, and this made her unhappy, and the others couldn't see why and said so. And Jane answered back, and by the time they went to bed, no one was speaking to anyone else. What bothered Jane most was a feeling that she'd forgotten something, and that if she could remember it, she'd know the reason for everything that had happened. It was as if the reason were there in her mind, somewhere, if only she could reach it. She leaned into her mind, reaching. The next thing she knew, she was sitting straight up in bed, and the clock was striking 11, and she had remembered. It was as though she'd gone on thinking in her sleep. Sometimes this happens. She got up and felt her way to the dresser where she'd put her money without looking at it when she came home from the fire. First she felt the top of the dresser. Then she lit the lamp and looked. The nickel she'd found in the crack in the sidewalk was gone. And then Jane began thinking really hard. Chapter 2, What Happened to Their Mother? We'll have to find out about that tomorrow. All right, we'll see you then.